Well, tonight we're going to finish up the book of 2 Corinthians. Going to look at the last two chapters there, chapters 12 and 13. For next week, kind of be thinking about preparing for the book of Galatians. Going to go right on into it. But tonight, as we look at these last two chapters, of course, we usually introduce the class with a question that kind of deals with at least one of the points that Paul addresses along these lines. So the question is along the lines, do you think it's normal for us to openly share our weaknesses with one another, or do you think that we tend to kind of keep our weaknesses hidden from one another?
I think it's just general nature that we tend to keep weaknesses, but we don't want to look that way to anybody. We want to be strong.
Yeah. So why is it? What is it about our weaknesses that we don't like telling other people about? What happens? Okay, people could use it against us.
Makes you feel vulnerable and maybe not in control, and admitting that I'm not perfect and I've got faults and problems and stuff I got to face.
Yeah, I think the general idea would be it kind of weakens people's view of us when we openly admit our weaknesses to them. Wouldn't you say that'd be true? We don't want people to think any less of us than what's a good way to put it? We don't want people to think any less of us than I guess normally what people would perceive or who people would perceive we are. And so you ever, maybe you haven't done this yourself, but maybe somebody has come to you. And sometimes we kind of deal with our weaknesses in what I'd call the third person language. And, somebody might come to you and say, well, I've got this friend, and he or she is in this situation. Or sometimes we might deal with it with a hypothetical. We might say, hypothetically speaking, if somebody were in this situation, we don't just come out and say, this is us and this is our situation. But we deal with it in a way that kind of deflects suspicion away from us and puts it on another person or even a hypothetical situation. So normally that language is something that we reserve for our weaknesses. But Paul, when he talks about himself, one of the things you might have noticed here in chapter 12, he talks about himself in the third person, what we call third person in the English. In other words, as he's talking about himself, he doesn't say I and me. He says, I know this man. And so he doesn't do it, though, normally why we would do it. Normally we would do it when we're talking something about our weaknesses, right? But he's actually talking about something that's extraordinary that has happened to him. He's actually talking about one of his strengths, but he's not doing it in a way that's braggadocious or, exalting himself, but he's just kind of talking about himself like he knows this guy and this was his situation. So we kind of mentioned, it's interesting as you read chapter 12 there, we kind of mentioned, why is Paul doing this? Remember last week what we studied?
Point out he's the real deal.
Yeah, remember his apostleship and his character and his motive had been questioned. And there were some false teachers that had come along and they were bragging themselves up. And, the church at Corinth was just eating up this language. And so Paul, in an effort to try to get them to understand what's going on and to see the truth, he said, I don't want to talk about myself this way, but I've got to because that's what you guys want to listen to. That's what impresses you. And so I've got to talk like a fool would talk and, use foolish language and just like these people are doing, so you'll listen to me and come to your senses. So that's kind of what Paul's talking about. And again, there are undertones as he's writing throughout these chapters. I'm not comfortable talking about myself in this way. I don't want to do it. I wouldn't do it if it wasn't necessary. But again, it's kind of reflected in the language he uses here in chapter 12, even though he's talking about an extraordinary event that happened to him. Yet he's doing it in third person to kind of deflect any glory or any honor that might come his way because of this experience. So we'll talk a little bit here, but in the first part of the chapter about Paul's vision. And before we really get into the idea of Paul having visions, this to me, this is probably one of the most extraordinary things that has ever happened to an individual. Would you agree with that? Did you read about Paul's vision here in chapter 12?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Did we read chapter 12? Do we know what we're talking about? For a person to have this happen to them, and here's the amazing thing. We never would have known anything about it had this situation at Corinth had not come up and Paul had to write to them in this way. So think about if this was something, that happened to you. Would you be telling people about it?
I'd have.
Man, it'd be hard not to, wouldn't it? Be hard not to. Just from the, not from the standpoint of look how great I am, but how extraordinary it was, and what an honor and a privilege it would have been to actually experience what Paul experienced here. But this wasn't the only vision that Paul had. Can you think of any other times in his life where Paul had visions?
Well, he's given one while he's there at Corinth to speak out.
Yeah.
He's given one to go to Macedonia.
Yeah. There are, if you go throughout the book of Acts, I wrote down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different times in the book of Acts that it states that Paul has some vision from God. And so this was just having a vision wasn't an out of the ordinary experience for Paul. This was something that happened to him several times throughout his lifetime. Imagine many more than what we even have recorded here in the Bible. But there were many times where the Lord appeared to him in a vision or gave him a vision. And so this is one of those instances where these false teachers are evidently bragging about, well, I got this vision from God. And so Paul said, listen, you want to talk about a vision from God? I've got one for you. Okay, so again, understand the context and why Paul is saying what he is. But notice if you go down to verse 7, he talks about there the abundance of the revelations that were given to him. And so this wasn't just a one-time vision that he got from God and never had another one. There were multiple times throughout his life where he received visions from the Lord himself. And there are probably visions along these lines that just aren't necessary for our salvation. We don't need to know about them, but nevertheless, they happen within the life of Paul. So question number 2 here, Paul describes himself. We've kind of answered that. Who was the man in Christ Paul described, and why is he doing this? Why is he writing about himself in the third person rather than the first? Why isn't he saying I and me?
Being humble.
Yeah, he wants to avoid exalting himself in this story that he's telling here. And so he tells a story about a man he knew about 14 years ago. This is what happened to him. Book of 2 Corinthians. No, we didn't study it very much. Anybody, the date, approximate date it was written?
Corinthians?
Yeah, 2 Corinthians.
Would have been mid-60s, wouldn't it?
I was thinking it was mid-50s. Is that right?
My record says 55.
55 or 56? Yeah, somewhere in that area, but some say 57. So backtrack 14 years from that, kind of give you an idea of where this is. You read about this vision, of course. Paul didn't know everything exactly what was happening as it happened. There were some questions that he himself had about, whether this was an out-of-the-body experience or an in-the-body experience. He said, I don't know. If you're out of the body, what's that?
It would be a spiritual experience.
That'd be dead.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're out of the body, you're dead. If you're in the body, you're still alive, aren't you? And so what Paul is talking about there is, I don't know if I was dead or I was alive when this vision occurred. Now, this is one of those places where we kind of say, well, when could this have been? You know, and I can't say for sure, but there's one instance that comes nearer to describing what went on here than I know of in the life of Paul. I do just want to mention back here in 2 Corinthians, remember in chapter 11, we read about, he talked about some of the suffering and the affliction and the persecution that he'd gone through for Christ. He mentions in verse 24 back in that chapter, he said, from the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. So I want to stop right there, because of all the things that Paul mentioned that he went through, which one of those would you think was near-death experience as any other? Well, it would be the stoning, right? Why did people stone other people in that day and age? You had one purpose in stoning, and that purpose was death, wasn't it? It wasn't just to hurt somebody, but it was to kill somebody, to put somebody to death. And so Paul references a time in his life where some people tried to put him to death by stoning him. Of course, there were numerous occasions where there were plots against the life of Paul, but the one that we really read about that comes near describing death than any other is the stoning experience. And I just mentioned real briefly, if you turn back to Acts chapter 14, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, but I do want to just read 2 verses here. Verses 19 and 20. It says, then the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city. Now notice this, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. There's a couple things that are pretty interesting, at least to me, from a personal study standpoint about this instance. The first of all is these Jews were involved in stoning Paul. There was one purpose in stoning Paul, and that was to put him to death. What did they think after they stoned him? Okay, do you think the Jews were merciful when they were stoning Paul? You think they were crossing their fingers and say, I hope we got him this time? I think that they were probably making sure beyond the shadow of a doubt he was dead, don't you? And when they believed he was dead, they drug him out of the city. Now, I want you to think about what happens next with Paul.
The disciples stood around about him.
Yeah, Paul gets up and he walks back into the city. Does that sound like a guy who's just been stoned to death? I don't know about you, but if I'd probably just been stoned and people thought I was dead, I don't think I could stand up, and I doubt I could be able to walk back into the city either. And I doubt I'd go back into the city. But it is kind of interesting, because could this be the place that Paul's describing here, where he says, I don't know if I was dead or I was alive? Could this be the place where he experienced this revelation? Well, again, it's of the events of the life of Paul, it would be the closest that I know of that are recorded in the Bible that would describe what Paul experienced and why he wouldn't know whether he was dead or alive. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but do a little bit of study and research on that, kind of form your own opinion there. But he didn't know. Didn't know if he was dead, didn't know if he was alive, but where did he go?
It says paradise.
Yeah, to the third heaven, right? What's that?
Would that be the heaven, right?
That's the dwelling place of God, right? In the Jews, you basically had 3 different heavens that they talked about. The third heaven was the dwelling place of God. You had atmosphere, you had the sky, you had the dwelling place of God. So Paul says, I went to the dwelling place of God. What happened when he went there?
He heard unspeakable things that are not lawful to speak. If that gels with John, when he was having his revelations about heaven, he said, you can't say what's next, some of those things. He said they can't know that.
Yeah. So he heard some things that he wasn't allowed to repeat. He couldn't go, when he came back to this earth, or again, whenever he came back to himself, whatever it be, whether he's in the body or out, he said, I heard some things that I couldn't tell anybody else about. Couldn't repeat. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine going to heaven and, I don't know, witnessing and hearing some things, and God says, you can't tell anybody about this?
But do you suppose that God just simply told him you can't tell anybody this, or he made it such that he didn't remember them?
I'd say Paul kept it quiet, wouldn't you?
Now, I'm sure he did.
Yeah.
Either way, but, because if they were, we don't have any idea what that was.
No, not a clue, do we? Not a clue. But again, just think about the experience here that Paul's writing about, how unique it is, how special it is, and what other person could ever say this? Some person said, well, I got a vision from the Lord. Some guy said, well, I went to heaven. And God told me some things that I can't repeat, can't tell to anybody else. Go ahead, brother.
One thing about the stoning that lends to the idea, I think we talked about this maybe even last Wednesday, the idea that he was resurrected, not just woke up. And you mentioned it a little bit in passing about him getting up and going back into the city. I no doubt Paul would go back into the city. That's Paul. You stoned me, okay, I'm coming back. But for stoning, there are broken bones. I don't care what your pain tolerance is. If the bone is broken, you're not walking.
Yeah.
You're just not. And so, like, when Christ resurrected Lazarus, I think it was, everything was fixed. Christ kept the holes in his hands for Thomas, basically, but he wasn't suffering and pouring blood out of his side when he was resurrected.
Yeah.
So it seems a lot more likely that he really did die than he just woke up.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's an interesting study. I don't know if we could say for sure, but like I pointed out, I think, just think about it logically, the evidence points that way. But again, I wouldn't be dogmatic about it. If somebody took issue with it, I'd have a lot of questions for them, but go ahead.
Are there any other examples in the Bible besides Paul and John talking about literally seeing stuff in heaven, like how it works? Saying you can't repeat this, you got to seal that up.
Well, the only person that I could think of would be Daniel. There were some things that he saw and was told, and God said you got to keep them sealed because the time's not at hand yet. But there were a lot of the prophets who saw heavenly visions, saw visions of God, and the throne of God and things like that. But as far as not being able to say anything about it, those would be the few that I would know of. So question number 3, let's move on here so we can get going. Why was Paul reluctant to speak about this vision? You say there in verse 6. Do what? Okay, well, yeah, that would certainly be part of it, wouldn't it? But what specifically does he say there in verse 6?
You don't want to.
Do what, brother?
He said, I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. I said that he just didn't, the reason that he was reluctant is he didn't want to be boastful.
Yeah, and then the last part of that verse, he says, but I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. And so Paul didn't want people to think of him differently because he had this heavenly vision. Paul says, you know who I am. You see me, you've seen what I've done, you've heard me teach, you know what kind of person I am. It would be like, somebody coming to us and telling us, I had this secret vision from God. Well, why would you tell me that? Would I look at you or think of you differently? What about a person who comes along and says, well, nobody else knows this, but let me tell you something. I raised somebody from the dead one time. Well, what Paul wanted is, he didn't want these, secret conversations with God to make people think of him as being a different person. He said, you guys know who I am. You've seen me in the flesh. You've heard me teach. And so that's how I want you to think of me. Not to think of me, more highly because I've had this heavenly vision from God. Question 4 kind of addressed that. Why did Paul refrain from boasting? He didn't want to make himself seem like a super spiritual person in the eyes of other people. I guess really he didn't want other people feeling that they were inferior to him. And so he's trying to, keep it in perspective where people don't develop an opinion of him that's too highly than we ought to think of a human being.
Well, and didn't he, and I don't think it's in Corinthians, but didn't he deal with one of the churches with the people being, I'm a follower of Paul, I'm a follower of Peter.
Yeah.
And if they believe what he's saying, it would be very easy for them to go, oh, we're going to follow him, and he ends up being their intercessor between them and God in their mind because he's closer.
Yeah.
So, it seems like a lot of it might be humility, of course, but also, if I brag about this, then they're going to essentially worship me, and then they're all lost.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but like you said, it's actually in the first letter that he wrote to the church at Corinth where they were doing that. But yeah, that probably wouldn't have helped the division by human names that much argument, would it?
And at that time, it's easy to get the division because we don't believe in, like if someone walks up and says, I raised somebody from the dead, our first response is going to be laugh in their face and then ask them if they sought help.
Yeah.
It's just because we don't live in the age of miracles. But these people all guaranteed by like the rule of 6 connections would at least know somebody who knows somebody who knew somebody who watched it happen.
Yeah.
So they're inclined, if he's like, look, I went to heaven and I was talking to God, and I can't tell you what he said because he told me not to, but we were hanging out in heaven. They're going to be, it'll make him more than just a super apostle.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not just in that day and age. That'd be true today too, wouldn't it? That's just kind of human nature, I think. We think more highly of humans than we ought to think. And that can be a preacher, that can be an elder, that can be somebody who's been a member of the church 50 years. Sometimes those things cause us to think of people more highly than we should. And so Paul didn't want anybody to view him in that way, did he? So what was it that prevented, question 5 here, Paul from having a proud spirit?
Going in the flesh.
Yeah, so he mentions, that could cause a man to get pretty proud. Things like this happening to you. So he says, so I didn't start, thinking of myself more highly than I ought to think. I was given a thorn in the flesh. And that's another interesting study that you can't really come to a concrete conclusion on. But I don't know. I've never really had a firm conviction maybe I shouldn't say conviction, but opinion, a firm opinion of what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. I've kind of looked at some of the different ideas, and I don't know any more than when I started. So go ahead, brother.
Why does he call it a messenger?
A messenger of Satan? Yeah. Well, something that Satan used, I think.
Yeah, but why messenger?
Well, it's something that Satan used. That's his messenger. So something that Satan would use to try to keep him from, I think, preaching the gospel and saving souls. Don't you?
Well, but I guess what I'm getting at, a messenger is somebody that's telling something all the time.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's thorn in the flesh. Go through Acts and see people chasing him, saying things about him. I've often wondered if that wasn't what he's talking about there, rather than necessarily eyes or or whatever. But no matter where he went, they were chasing him.
They were.
It wasn't like they just happened to appear there. They were following from town to town to town.
Yeah.
And so,
But he refers to it as an it in verse 8.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, like I said, we could talk about it all night. We'd still not know the concrete answer of it, but you know, there was something, to me, it was in his flesh. And so that kind of indicates to me, this is just my opinion. Like I said, Dennis expressed his. I always tell you, if you want somebody else's opinion, tell them to get up here. So, but my opinion is it was something in his body and something very painful. Beyond that, I don't really have
He might have had gout.
do what?
He might have had gout. I'm not trying to be funny. It's
Yeah.
painful.
But I mean, when you think of a thorn, you know, you don't just think of it as a nuisance, do you? Anybody ever had a thorn in the flesh? Keep it in there. What happens? Yeah, it becomes super sensitive, doesn't it? Very painful. And so I think there's something to do with his body that was very painful that, you know, kept him humble, kept him understanding he had a weakness, kept him close to God, and you know, needed God during those difficult times. So
I always thought it was the eyes. It could be, could not, but Galatians 4:15 talked about that they would have given me their own eyes if they could have.
yeah,
And I always put that back to the thorn in the flesh. And other letters it talks about, you can see I wrote with my own hand. And that to me made me think there was something different. I was writing hard or something, because I usually didn't do it. So I always tied those things together and put it back. It could be anything. That's what I always thought it was.
yeah. And you know, a lot of people who take that path tie it back to all the appearance of Jesus on the road to Damascus, where, you know, evidently something happened to his eyes, because he said there's like scales that fell off of them. So I don't know, but yeah, there's all kinds of paths you can pursue, and like I said, in the end you'll come back and you know nothing for concrete. So it is an interesting study, and it is an interesting idea. But that the main point that Paul's making here is not particularly what it is, but what's the point he's making about this?
Divine intervention
Okay.
in a way that sends in the other direction. You've got divine intervention that guides you, and divine intervention that suppresses your own personal bias.
Yeah, you know, this is one of the amazing things about, we're not going to get very far tonight, so we'll just stop and talk about it. But this is one of the amazing things to me about, you know, when you talk about God knowing what's best for us. Because if everything that ever happened in our life was good and positive, what kind of people do you think we'd be?
Not so great.
We'd probably be some pretty arrogant, proud, selfish people, don't you think? And so what God knows is He knows how much suffering and humility and weakness we need to kind of even things out. And that's what Paul was talking about here. You know, so I had all this abundance of revelations, but so I didn't get too proud and arrogant. I got a thorn in the flesh to go with it. And he kind of pointed out in that, you know, it helped him from being too proud. And it glorified God. You know, one of the things that's you find throughout the Bible is the weaker the person and the weaker the thing that God does to accomplish something great, the more it glorifies His name. And so the more weaknesses we have when God uses us, brings more honor and glory to His name. It shows you how great that He is. But it also allows us to draw closer to God in a way that we wouldn't without suffering and without problems and without tribulation. And so there's positives that came from it. Now, Paul said, man, if I had my choice, I'd have God remove it. In fact, he said, I asked 3 times to have it removed, but God said no. And the reason He said no is for the things that we talked about there. You know, help guard you against pride, bring more honor and glory to God, and again, draw you closer to God in the way that you wouldn't have if you didn't have this weakness. Go ahead.
Since you run down the rabbit hole anyway, So the most powerful revelation he had was, we're guessing when he was stuck. It's sort of, do you think the thorn in the flesh, because he doesn't say exactly when he got it, he just says, through this abundance of revelations, hey, I also got this other thing. So do you think that perhaps after his most intimate revelation of God, a remnant of that stoning, I mean, maybe he just didn't heal one thing that's just never going to heal, or something like that. And obviously we can't know, but he didn't have it before he became an apostle.
Yeah, I don't know. Does anybody see any wording that indicates exactly when it would have come on him? I don't really see anything in the language itself.
So to keep me from becoming conceited.
Yeah.
So, that follows the other thing, the third heaven. I don't know.
Yeah, could be. I never thought of it that way, but like I said, all possibilities are open.
It's good mental exercise.
It is, yeah. Yeah, but it is, there's sometimes when we study these things, sometimes we think, well, you can't really know much or anything, but the more you dig into it, you do find some little hints and things like that. And so I think it's always helpful. But, it should help us as Christians, because how does that help us, or how should it help us with our weaknesses?
We realize that we can become stronger in our weaknesses, if God does become stronger in our weaknesses.
Yeah. All of us have physical weaknesses and things in our life, but those are things that can help us draw closer to God, aren't they? They can make us stronger spiritually, like Gary was talking about there. And so Paul learned that. He lived with his weaknesses, and the way that he helped to get through those physical weaknesses is realize, the benefits, the divine and spiritual benefits that were provided to him through these weaknesses. So,
Can I say one more thing?
go ahead.
This is totally different. We want to keep the history in mind about Paul before he was on the road to Damascus, because what he was doing as a Christian before that, did any of the other apostles do anything like that? Okay, this is his. I feel like part of his story, because he has to remember all the things that he's done to the Christians before that, and he can have to carry that with him the rest of his life, And so that's going that would be a thorn in my flesh. So I have to remember that, and then he's still having to be an apostle to try to he'll never get that back. I mean, it's like if we were having to pay for something we done on earth, in our time, we still have to we have to live with it. We have to go to jail or whatever. He's going to carry that with him the rest of his life. So
Yeah.
I don't know what that's going to flesh. I believe it would be one in my flesh.
I'd say that'd be a pretty painful thing to revisit, wouldn't you? Like you said, knowing Paul and just knowing, his desire to do what's right and serve God, and then, figuring out he hadn't been, and like you said, he hurt all those people in the process. That would be, I never really thought about that, but that's a good point. Yeah. So anyway, didn't get very far, but if you read the rest of chapter 11 or chapter 12, he kind of uses a lot of sarcasm again. So he kind of asks him the question, well, now who's the super apostle? You guys thought these guys were super apostles. I told you about all these things. Who should you be bragging about? Who showed the signs of an apostle among you? And so he uses sarcasm when he says, well, I am inferior to them in one way. I didn't take any money from you. Please forgive me for that, okay? I always like when you read about individuals here and then their character comes out in their writing. Makes them more human to me. But he ends chapter 13, just telling he's going to come. He wrote to him because he wanted them to correct things. He didn't want to come there and have to, fight with them and discipline them. And he wanted to have a pleasant visit whenever he came. He kind of ends the letter with, kind of Paul's customary things. He says, just keep cultivating grace and love and peace in your lives. And that's some of the best advice that you could give to any Christian or any church. All right, so 2 Corinthians, anybody got any thoughts, comments? Next week we'll start the book of Galatians, Lord willing.